parks, and that's very encouraging that we've tapped into some real local interest with our town history as we build up to our big celebration in September of bicentennial. Well, Ingrid and I have met and we've talked about how we're going to present this talk, and I'm going to present the part that goes with how the library was used, how it evolved over time, and she's going to focus on the building of the library, the architecture, and the background of William Ross. So with that in mind, I'm just going to start off a little bit with background. That this library didn't start off with this building here, as you can see in this watercolor of Arnold Prince's painting. It started off in people's minds here in Chaplin in 1901. A group of people, let's see, Winslow B. Gallup, Mrs. Mary Gallup, Florence Hunt, Mrs. E. Jessie Hunt, Charles Knight, and Clarence Chester were the first people that I could find in the record who organized the very idea of a library in this little eastern Connecticut town. Somehow or other, they got the town fathers to donate $200 to help them get started. Can you imagine? This town, from what I understand when I had a chat with Bernard Church years ago, Chaplin population in 1900 was not even 1,000 people. So if I'm incorrect, I'm going to blame Bernard. So if you had under 1,000 people and the town gives you $200, just figure that's a big sum of money at that time. So they encouraged this group to get started, to buy books, and to establish a library. And as Ingrid's going to point out, the library movement was pretty big at this time across the country. So I won't steal any of her thunder about that, but this was part of it. And so this little group of people started in 1901 and persevered until we get to William Ross. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me today. Congratulations on your bicentennial to the entire Chaplin community. And Leslie, thank you very much for the t-shirt. I'm an honorary citizen of Chaplin today. Thank you, everybody. We're calling this the celebration of life because this is more than just about William Ross and his magnanimous donation. It's really about the town of Chaplin, the community of Chaplin. And so what we see here, as Leslie mentioned, is the interpretive mural detail in the library today above the circulation desk. And I just want to step back to the beginning of the turn of the last century and recollect what Chaplin may have been all about in the 1900s. Okay, what did the Ross Library, which was such a magnanimous and very special gift, a real statement architecturally and also culturally, what did it mean in 1911? How was it conceived? And that's what Leslie's going to talk today a lot about. Why was it important to the community and to the surrounding area? Where did its architectural inspiration actually come from? How was it used as a cultural institution and civic institution until it was decommissioned not too long ago? And Leslie will speak to that. And we also want to acknowledge today the new owner of the lovely Ross Library building, and who is here today with her mom. And this is Eleanor Devane and Margaret Devane, who are the new owners of this important historical building. So we also want to acknowledge many of the resources we've used to put this talk together, a talk that we're calling Our Conversation, because we're going to include you in this conversation, since many of you have used the library and you are part of the library community. And we want to thank the Chaplin Bicentennial Committee, the public library here, and the historians and magicians of the wonderful Celebrate Chaplin calendar that has restored photographs in it. Thank you, Victor Boomer. So, just want to, we're going to answer these questions today, and moving forward to what Leslie had just mentioned, the state of the library in 1901. And some of this is recorded in the history of Windham County, but basically it was kind of a subscription library at the time, and with a few funds from individuals and from the church and from $200 from the town. And what we have here is, we're going to step back and do the history of the libraries in Connecticut. In 1839, the state of Connecticut Department of Education, or what was then the Board of Education, agreed that every single school district should be allotted a small school library. And was kind of silent on the funding, although the State Board of Education did provide money. By about 1875, 1876, the State Board of Education and the legislature agreed that every town should probably have a library independent of the school, and that was probably a good idea. But there was no effort made to fund such an institution. So by 1881, the effort to fund a public library in every single town was theoretically agreed upon, and a town could raise 2 mills per every dollar valuation, property valuation, to fund a library, which didn't amount to very much. But by 1893, what happened is the legislature decided it was going to mandate a public library in every single Connecticut town, consistent with the American Library Board Association's recommendations. So what happened is that the new Connecticut Library Board was placed under the aegis of the State Board of Education, because books and libraries were part of the educational curriculum and the extension of the educational institution in Connecticut. Anyway, here we have a summary by the State Library Board Secretary Carolyn M. Hewins, who writes in this elaborate study in Connecticut Magazine from 1904, happened to have a copy in Columbia, and she says, she gives a state of all the libraries in every single town. 71 towns have none. Many towns have something of a subscription library. And in 1901, as Leslie mentioned, the selectmen of Chaplin had voted to have a free public library. So what was it? And she describes it here. It's sort of hard to see, but she talks about it. The Chaplin Library, through exertions of a reading circle, is on the high road to owning a pleasant house, freshly painted and papered, with a piano for entertainments, and a room where the librarian sells ice cream to swell the library funds. Okay, so this was
Right? That would get a lot of people in, wouldn't it?
So, you know, the question is, what kind of ice cream did she sell? She had to have made it herself, because there was no Walmart or, you know, Friendly's.
Farmer's cow.
Oh, yeah. In any case, so this was quite an effort, and Carolyn M. Hewins' summary is very generous.
Could I interject here a little bit, because in that 1901 town report, that was all very new to Chaplin, and they didn't know how to record this. So the report was put under miscellaneous, which I thought was kind of funny. And besides the $200 that was initially allocated, it gave an additional, hold your hat, $21.77. 1902-03, that went up to $54.21, and they also allocated $25 a year for the librarian, and that $25 stipend remained for over a decade. So they didn't have any increase in that. Florence Hunt was the first librarian. This was before the Ross Library was built. And in my own modern parlays, I just looked at the way the library had to move around. At first, there was a mention in the book that Sandy loaned me, which was called the Secretary's Minutes, and it recorded from 1901 to 1949 minutes of the meetings of the library. In that book, they talked about the vestry. So apparently, the library had first been in the church, and then it moved to this very nice, well-painted house with ice cream. But I thought of it as kind of couch surfing, because the library didn't stay in one place for very long. Warren?
I understand that this is before the library got started, that there was a collection of books,
Yeah.
and it was kept at the, well, it's now abandoned museum down the other end of Chapman Street before it became the town hall.
Wow, I hadn't run across that in the minutes, but that's good to know. That's interesting. So yeah, because crowding books around can't be that much fun, but they did it up until we move on to the next stage here.
Okay, so this is the amazing contrast from 1904 to 1911. And this is a postcard from 1920, but it will probably pretty much the same in 1911. This extraordinary, beautiful, architected building. And please note, it has some interesting items on the roof ridgeline. Okay, and this library continued to serve not just as a public library, but as Chaplin's a community civic institution. We see there's a bulletin of the William Ross Public Library, and this is a gift courtesy of Catherine Smith. It's basically, I think it's a pen and watercolor rendition of the library as it looked in 1934, when it was the civic institution of the community. So I just step back and say, well, who was this gentleman, William Ross Jr., who was so magnanimous in giving this gift? And thanks to a very interesting talk by Dr. Brendan Kane, we learned in Benjamin Chaplin's will that there is somebody that Benjamin Chaplin bequeathed some money to, £100, paragraph 29, in which he mentions an Ebenezer Ross. And Ebenezer Ross turns out to have been Mary Payne's son from a prior marriage, who, when she married Benjamin Chaplin, then came to live in the Benjamin Chaplin household. So the bottom line here is that William Ross's two times great-grandmother was Mary Payne Ross, who was Benjamin Chaplin's wife. So in essence, what we can surmise is that the Rosses, through William Ross Jr., William Ross Sr., Nathan Ross, and Ebenezer Ross were part of the Chaplin legacy and part of the first family of Chaplin. And that is, I think, interesting and new information. Here we have a diagram that shows the genealogy. You can come up and look at this a little bit later on. I don't want to dwell on it here, but it was interesting to see what the connection to Benjamin Chaplin was. And here's a picture of William Ross Jr., who donated the library, and most of the Rosses are buried in the Chaplin Old Cemetery here. Okay, so this is where, thanks to this lovely photograph and the calendar that you've seen, William Ross lived in an estate on Tower Hill Road, probably a beautiful house built by his father. It mentions in the calendar that it was the first house in Chaplin to have indoor plumbing. And I say that's a very interesting detail. My guess is it may have been among the houses in Chaplin that also had a library. So what is a library? A library is two things, one of which is a collection of books. And so it's very likely in an estate such as this that in fact there was a collection of books and this family were literate and readers. So the second meaning of the word library is that it is a building that houses collections of books. And I want to go back to the notion that we just learned a few moments ago that a library was a new concept in New England and in Connecticut as well. Okay, so where might William Ross have found architectural inspiration? Because we will learn in a moment that he spent a lot of time designing the library that he donated to the community. And in fact, there's a library in Columbia, which is virtually identical in footprint and in siting and in aspect. And this is the Saxon B. Little Free Library from 1903. It's now called the History Place, and it has pretty much the same blueprint and some of the same exterior architectural features, even though the building materials are quite different. So you can see some items in common, which are typical of both libraries and of other libraries in New England, which includes a granite walkway leading up to an elevated building that has this Byzantine Romanesque revival archway. Okay, and here we also have a granite apron around this particular building, the Saxon B. Little Library. We have some interesting features that includes a tower. This one has a balustrade. That had a balustrade. It uses monumental granite. The Byzantine archway leads to a dark liminal space, which is illuminated by a lamp of learning. Okay, all of these elements are symbolic of the importance of this new type of building for a new purpose. And there's some other interesting architectural features that I'll point out in a moment a little bit more, but you see these very, very wide eaves, monumental windows, and extremely angular gables. So these are all sort of part of the Romanesque architecture, Richardson Romanesque, and I'll get to the importance of Richardson Romanesque in the next few slides. One thing we happen to have in Columbia that's very helpful, and for this talk in particular, is we have the blueprints from 1903, 1902 and 1903, and Wilton E. Little was the architect of Columbia's library. He was an architect who worked for the Morrison Company in Willimantic. He designed mostly industrial style buildings in eastern Connecticut. This building, according to National Park architectural historians, is called Queen Anne and Richardson Romanesque shingle style. Again, the building in Columbia is primarily wood on a granite base with granite foundation and granite stairs. Okay, so we have the blueprints that some of you have seen personally. And that includes, this is the main reading room. As you enter through the archway, and you go into the main reading room with the open stacks concept. There's a window with a seating bench on the right. The stairway, similar to the Ross Library, was originally a part of this design, and of course, a tower that was also used as a reading area. And this is a blueprint of the loft plan. It's a very large loft. And basically, the two buildings, as we have come to see them, are virtually identical in blueprint. Okay. So here is a sketch, sketches by Wilton E. Little also, of the south-facing facade with the beautiful tower that originally did have a metal balustrade with urns and other decorative features in Columbia. And this is the north-facing facade on the side. And it has a very curious dormer kind of arrangement here. And this is one of an adapted Romanesque, Richardson Romanesque feature called an eyelid, kind of like for an eyelid dormer. And I'm going to go into that in just a moment. But so in reality, this is kind of what the building looks like just a few weeks ago. And you can see the, again, on the south facade, the tower doesn't have a balustrade. It has very wide eaves and slight curvature to the entranceway. And here we have that on the north-facing side, that little protrusion above the two monumental windows that is very typical of Richardson Revival architecture. Okay. So we come back to the William Ross Library as it looked in 1920, and certainly as it looked when it was dedicated in 1911. And again, the features here are the use of monumental granite, which is quite notable, contrasting brick and slate. It has undeniably a Romanesque Revival exterior facade. And the interior includes beautiful fireplace, a mirrored fireplace, stained glass, as we'll see in a moment. It's really quite exquisite, and was conveyed as a memorial gift. Now, I want to underscore the word memorial gift because this was an important way to memorialize your town and provide a legacy for the future. Okay. And the notion of providing a library as a memorial gift was a brand new tradition that emerged in the late 1800s, really from around 1860 to, well, on forward, in giving a grand public library to your small town if you were a wealthy industrialist or heir of some sort. And most of these memorial public libraries were given in New England, okay, because that's where they were conceived, and in eastern Massachusetts and southern New England. There are a few in Connecticut.
I'd like to fill in here that we're up to the point where we're looking at our library, that in 1910, which is when the process started, the selectmen and the library board met at Mrs. Ross's house. William Ross had died in 1908, correct? But she's carrying out his wishes, which were her wishes as well, apparently. But they met at her house up on Tower Hill Road, where to discuss the building plans, because I guess this had already been talked about, and to accept the deed to this piece of property, this plot of land, which she apparently had owned, right in the middle of Chaplin Street. And to select a building committee. They asked her to be the chair of the building committee, which I thought was a great gesture on their part, because she had the plans. But they also accepted from her $2,500 to build the library. In addition to that, however, she gave another $1,000 to be held in trust, so that the income of that trust could be used to support the library, that it would not be an obligation of the town, at least initially. So was a nice package, and besides that, she put the cherry on the cake by donating the whole Dewey Decimal System for cataloging. So she really was influential in setting this library up as a running operation. So it was dedicated, as Ingrid said, in November of 1911, but it didn't open until the following February, so they could get all the shelves full of books and get it all settled. And it was said at the time, this is a quote from the record, "It was one of the finest and best equipped libraries to be found in the small towns of this state." So it's clear that at the time it was recognized by one and all that this was a unique building and had a wonderful, real potential. So, and by 1915, there were 640 books in the library in circulation, and it was open Wednesdays and Saturdays, Wednesday and Saturday afternoons during the summer. During the winter, it was just open on Wednesdays. So that was the beginning of the whole thing. Go ahead.
So I am going to just kind of go out on a limb a little bit. Turns out, that this library, as Leslie just mentioned, was very special architecturally. And where else might William Ross have gotten inspiration? Well, it turns out that the foremost library designer of the day was indeed Henry Hobson Richardson, who was contemporary of William Ross. He lived from 1838 to 1886. He was educated at Harvard, born in New Orleans, educated at Harvard, and he studied architecture in France at the School of the Beaux-Arts. There were no architecture schools in the United States at the time. And when he came back to the United States, he said that he wanted to create a uniquely American architecture, something that was grounded in the United States, in the ethos of the United States. And his designs became, partly influenced actually by Romanesque architecture in southern France, and partly influenced by architecture of Japanese shrines, thanks to his friend William Morris, the famous printer, philosopher, and commentator about the arts and crafts movement. Anyway, long story short, Richardson included some Japanese features in his buildings, in his library buildings, and he also placed his designs in the public view for others to comment on, and including in the periodical American Architect and Building News in 1876, where he published all of his library plans for other architects in the United States to use and emulate. And I believe that local architects such as Wilton E. Little and a few others that we'll see in a moment copied elements of his design. Anyway, so I mentioned he adopted some curious features from Japanese architecture. And so we see here in the insert, a Shinto shrine. And you can see the gables, the A-frame gables, the wide eaves, and these curious elements on the roof line of the shrine. And actually, amazingly, Hobson writes about those, the shrine elements as important to his architecture. And they are referred to as karahaku elements that add to the silhouette and spatial concept of his library buildings. Now, he was known as the premier architect for small libraries in his day. He was also known as a premier architect for railroad stations and small civic public buildings. Anyway, so here you see on the Ross Library these little nubs, and you say, my goodness, what are those? Those are the Karahafu elements that he actually writes about, that he had kind of borrows from the concept of Shinto shrines in Japan. And what do those elements do for the shrine? Well, it turns out that these shrines are dedicated to deities, and his view was that these elements provide a guidepost for the spirits to enter the sanctuary, enter the special building. So here we have them, perhaps curiously, on the Ross Library. An interesting feature that we've always wondered about. Okay, where else might William Ross have gotten inspiration? Well, there are some similar buildings in terms of use of materials in New England. The Thompson Hall, the University of New Hampshire Library, designed by architects Dow and Randlett in 1892, used many of the same materials we see in the Ross Library, the use of extensive monumental granite and brickwork. And here you see the Thomas Crane Public Library. This is this is Henry Hobson's most famous library building, and it's in Quincy, Massachusetts. People can visit it, and it's on the National Register, and you see the archetypical Byzantine arch, the steps leading up to the elevated reading room. It's hard to see in this image, however, there is an illumination here, the lamp of learning in the dark liminal space, and you go into the library, which is will enlighten you with the knowledge therein, according to Andrew Carnegie. Also on the exterior, you see the use of these eyelid dormer windows, which is very typical of Richardson's own designed libraries, and these little roofline elements as well. So this is one of Richardson's famous libraries in the Boston area. Okay, coming back to the William Ross Library, we have many similar but adapted features, because also during this time the American Library Association was beginning to get a little bit nervous about Richardson's library designs. They were not particularly what we would call user-friendly, and they wanted a little bit brighter interiors, stacks that were not so tall, that required ladders, and that had sight lines that you could actually see what the patrons were doing. Richardson's nooks and crannies did not meet their specifications. Anyway, his designs, his exterior designs, were very popular until about 1910. Okay, so to kind of wrap up my part here, what was a free public library in 1900? It was basically an invention of a new type of building in the late 19th century, and predominantly in southern New England and eastern Massachusetts. It turns out that 200 of the 450 purpose-built library buildings were in the Boston vicinity, and they were usually memorial gifts to their small towns by wealthy industrialists or their heirs. They coincided, their building coincided with public education reform in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, and later Connecticut, and were typically seen as a cultural necessity, an imperative for the laboring middle classes and immigrants in large urban areas. And I think
if you remember, or if you know about Willimantic and the fact that they brought in so many immigrants, that the third floor of the company store, which now serves as the Wyndham Textile and History Museum, that was a library that the company invented and formed there to help the immigrants learn to read and write. So that conforms with that statement there, I think, very nicely. So, and ties it into something very local.
And so these libraries actually enabled equity for educational, moral, and self-improvement, and that's discussed in detail in this article from 1904 by Carol Hewins. And basically they were overseen by professional librarians, often associated with the American Library Association, or by local educators. And I think in smaller communities, in rural communities such as Chaplin and Columbia, they were a little bit different. But basically in urban areas, they were seen as the only means by which immigrants could actually obtain self-education. In 1893, the Connecticut General Assembly mandated a free public library in every town, and under the aegis of the State Board of Education. And this is kind of an important point because other states did not have this kind of governance of public libraries as a predominantly educational institution. So the Connecticut Library Board designated funding for book purchases as part of the school district curriculum, and they were very strict about what books were allowable and which books were not.
So I'm going to jump in here and let you know a little bit about what kind of books the library had. And in 1911, and you can probably, I think this is reasonable, that they favored the Western canon, you know, the great books of Western Europe and England in particular. So what did they buy, or what did they get from the state, from the designated from the state library? A book called Guy Mannering, Rob Roy, Kenilworth. They also had the great poets, mostly British, Shakespeare, of course, Wordsworth, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Robert Browning, Burns, and then Byron, which, if you've ever read Byron, was considered pretty racy at the time. So I don't know if you had to take this out in a brown paper bag or what, but he was there in the first library. They also had periodicals. One was The American Boy, Housekeeper. You can think of the population of Chaplin. Independent, I'm not sure what the Independent was, but it was a magazine you could borrow. Recreation, Technical World, St. Nicholas, which I know is a children's magazine which had lots of games and stories in it, and Cosmopolitan. So the people who took out Byron also maybe took out Cosmopolitan. Anyway, I thought that was quite an interesting collection. And in 1924, the minutes of the secretary's book had a vote that they had to return. Now, this was written with a capital R, double underline, that the board will return this book, Homes and Haunts of the Indians. I looked it up on Google. Homes and Haunts of the Indians was published in 1923 and by Albert Henry Hauser, and it was about the joys of collecting Indian artifacts. I have no idea why they had to return it, but it was considered not apparently an acceptable book in our library. Who knows?
I can't imagine why.
When you mentioned education and the curriculum, teachers in our new library in the early 1900s were allowed to borrow books only if they could show how they were going to use those books in the classroom. And children under 12 were not allowed to borrow books because I'm assuming that, and this is only my assumption, that they considered children under 12 didn't have the proper appreciation of books, or wouldn't take care of them. I don't know. But anyway, no children under 12 could borrow books. So I thought that was pretty restrictive in those early days. But as we'll learn, some reasons perhaps why they thought that. Okay.
Okay. All right, so, okay, we're about to enter the building. This was last summer before Mr. May purchased the building. And I'm just going to continue what was the library in 1900, the Free Public Library. It was a permanently non-circulating, discriminating collection, as Leslie mentioned, of reference books, maps, Harvard classics, I think, of Audubon's, books of Audubon's prints, of literary publications, sometimes donated artwork, and cultural objects. The Thomas Crane Library in Quincy actually had an art gallery associated with it to commemorate the family. It was a circulating set of curriculum-related literary novels, geography, history, and mathematics school books. And it was intended for adults and children, offered lectures and cultural activities, and we'll get to those in a moment. And these small town library buildings were designed by, I'll call them second-tier architects, not pejoratively, but they were inspired by Richardson's designs, architects who experimented with the best of his design. And as I mentioned earlier, the American Library Association ultimately repudiated his library designs because the interiors were too dark, and the stacks were too high, and the nooks and crannies were too many. And by 1900, philanthropist Andrew Carnegie offered his own alternatives and his own architects to the tune of over 1,689 libraries that he funded through the foundation.
This is a fascinating screen because the minutes of the library board meetings are full of information. They don't have enough information in some cases, but the nuggets that you do get out of them are just fascinating. For example, when you mentioned that for adults and children, woe be to the person, the family, that went over their date to return books. Because in 1925, a board member was appointed to talk with Henry Lucas to return his overdue books. And the first time that the library expanded its use beyond loaning of books and periodicals was in 1925. Now, you all know when the women got the vote, right? The 19th Amendment. In 1925, the League of Women Voters asked the board of directors if they could have a meeting at the library, and the board of directors said they could. So I thought, wow, they're getting very progressive here. They're allowing the League of Women Voters to have a meeting. I was hopeful about that. By 1944, young folks, that's in my quotes, could come on Wednesday nights from 7 to 9 to play games. That was another attempt at outreach. However, they had to be closely supervised. So no funny business. I mean, they were very protective of this building and the collection. And that can't be overstressed because it's very, very clear in the minutes. I'll get into the part where they were so concerned about maintaining the structure, the infrastructure of the building. But the collection was really sacrosanct. They guarded it and protected it. Now, Ingrid mentioned Andrew Carnegie. Did he have anything? Did the people in Chaplin even know about him? The minutes are there. In 1904, April, the ladies, I don't know why it's always the ladies that have to write these letters, but the ladies of the board were asked to pen a letter to Andrew Carnegie. This is where that's it. We don't know what they asked for. Did they ask, because it's before the Ross Library was built. Were they asking to have some donation or what? We just don't know what they were asking, but or whether they were even answered. So that's as far as we go in that direction. One other thing about the collection and how much the library boards guarded it and protected it. In 1937 minutes, it was noted that the board, please ask Mrs. Burdick, I don't know which Mrs. Burdick this was, to destroy any books that she had borrowed because there was scarlet fever in the house. And that's the only case that I could find, either in the town reports or in the minutes of this book, where there was any reference to an infectious disease, not the 1918 pandemic or anything else, but they didn't want anything to do with scarlet fever, that's for sure. They were willing to destroy the books in that case. So, all right.
Okay, so here we have just another photograph, a kind of combined photograph showing you the lovely architectural mortar work of the facade of the corner and of the facade of the library. And we step into the interior as it looked last summer. As we are walking inside, many of you have walked inside many times, I'm sure. On the right is the kind of the built-in bench with monumental windows, and the very lovely fireplace with the mirrored section above it. The stairway to the loft is right here in back, and the stacks are positioned around the walls of the library below the casement windows, and the stacks were more or less in the middle, and the librarian's desk, I understand, was sort of on this side.
And it moved. I saw in the one of the town reports that the librarian's table was actually more central, so people saw it just when they came right in the door. But so that's interesting because they did move it around. Could we go back to the previous slide? Because I don't think we've mentioned the person who actually built the library, physically, the stonemason. And I think this is a good example. You can see more of a close-up of the building itself outside. It was George Eastman Snow. I'm sure Snow is a familiar name to many of you here. He was Ruth Snow Bowen's father, and he lived right here in town. He was a master builder, and later he was called back to to do some cement work here, some concrete work, and he's the one that put in that railing so that people wouldn't fall down the steps. That was not there originally if you look at the earlier photographs. The record is full of concern about maintenance of this building, even not very long after it was built. In 1924, they voted for the lady members, you love this division of labor, the lady members to repair any books. There were like 50. I saw there were 50 books at one point that had to be repaired. But Mr. Knott, K-N-O-T-T, Mr. Knott, was to find, his job was to go out and find the proper glue. So, in the same year, it was voted to start collecting items of history, of Chaplin history, for future reference. So anybody who questions whether there should be a museum in Chaplin, it's in the early record. People in that library were conscious of trying to preserve our past. So I think that's a good message to have from the historical era. What were the things that they wanted to repair all the time? The minutes over the years are mostly filled with the care and preservation of the building, and as well as the collection. Painting, waxing. Who was going to mow the lawn? Does this sound familiar to current board members? Who's going to do the landscaping and mowing the lawn, shoveling the snow? Pointing up the outside. These bushes grew up close to the foundation, and they had to be cut back, and they interfered with the foundation. So this is a good one. Keeping children off the terraces. You know, those are pretty inviting, tempting places for kids to roll down those terraces on the outside or slide down. Anyway, the board was worried that they were going to erode those terraces. So repairing books, I've mentioned before, buying cordwood. Anybody want to guess how much they paid for a cordwood? Maybe then it was a lot. $6 to $8 a cord. And it took 2 cords of wood a year to fuel that building, to heat it. And that became another issue over time. And Bill Rose is right here. They talked about trying to get a right of way back in the 30s to bring that cordwood up to the library. I don't know how they did it. Did they wheelbarrow it or something? I have no idea. But it was back then they needed a right of way. In 1948, the slide that you just showed, the interior. See that grate there? Anybody as a child or who had children know about that grate when it started up and all that hot air came blasting out? Wasn't that terrific? I mean, my kids loved it. In 1948, they bought a pipeless furnace. I don't know what that means, a pipeless furnace. It doesn't sound like it would work, but then from Montgomery Ward for $203.50. And they still bought 3 cords of wood in 1949, so it was still pretty primitive, according, you know, and that from that standpoint, right up after World War II. All right.
Okay, we have some lovely features here, and I think we have an update about
Yes.
these. So
This was an amazing fact that I found in the record. In 1944, the minutes said that they needed money to repair the stained glass window. They didn't say what was broken about it or anything like that. Then a while later, they said they needed to replace it. So that's all the information that there is. So evidently that is not the original window, as I just assumed it was, nor do we know who made the new window. I'm just so glad that they decided to keep a stained glass window. They could have very easily just put a piece of glass in. Bill, do you know anything about it?
No, but there's also the window over the archway. Do we know which window was replaced or repaired?
They said stained glass.
There's some stained glass, I
Yeah.
believe, in that upper window. That half moon window. Isn't there a couple of yellow panels in that?
Oh,
Eleanor, do you remember?
I would have said
This
no,
one here?
but I'm not positive.
Yes.
It's a lidded glass window, though,
It
with
is.
panels and pieces in there.
Yeah, I
Oh,
don't-
no, it's not. Okay. I
Yeah.
thought the center archway was yellow down at the bottom or something.
it doesn't look like that, unless they did replace it with just glass. But they said stained glass in the minute, so I'm
It
assuming.
just seems like an obvious place for stained glass. That's the only reason it really came to mind.
It does.
perhaps an item for future research.
Yes, an item for future research, yeah. Where are all those future high school seniors doing their senior projects? I mean, that would be great. All right.
Okay, well, it is truly, it is tinted stained glass in the loft as well. It's a kind of a green, and we'll see that from the interior in just a moment. But in a nutshell, what was this library? It was a free public library, a memorial gift to the town of Chaplin. William Ross enabled Chaplin to have a brand new educational and civic institution very quickly, truly a grand public library building. It turns out he planned every detail of it. According to the dedicatory poem, I'll give you a few, 2 stanzas at the end. This poem is by Josephine Robbins. And he chose the interior design and footprint, I think, created pretty much along the same lines as Wilton E. Little, and adapted the Columbia footprint, if you will, which was already an adaptation of the Richardson Romanesque style. And especially the exterior, in selecting the very talented local stonemason, George Eastman Snow, for the beautiful exterior. And this was a legacy to the town he loved. So the poem was a dedicatory poem, as I mentioned, written by Josephine Robbins, and the day of the dedication that Leslie mentioned was November 18, 1911. It was a day-long event with a lot of activities, and it was quite interesting, but the two paragraphs at the end are most telling. They go, then we knew what we had never dreamed of, that before his work he laid down, that's before he passed away, he had planned in a generous spirit for the church and his own native town. For the church, unless needed helping, for the town, this building so fair, substantial, convenient, and handsome, each detail planned out with care. And she, who faithfully watched him, his new wife, as far as a mortal may go, has lovingly added her present, that Leslie mentioned, that the building no lacking may show. We thank you today, we thank you, as your townsman will do to the end. And thanks we cannot give him. We give you, our sister and friend. So, as it turned out, there were many people who attended the dedication from many different states, and it was a day-long event. It was quite an affair.
Wow. I'm going to fill out the time of the library for the last 40 years or so. As I said, I went through all of the town reports and I found some fascinating, as you can tell, fascinating information. So I'd like to fill you in on from the 1960s on. I looked up all of the librarians, the library directors from 1901 to the present. And this list is up here if you'd like to take a look at it. It's quite revealing. There's many of the people I became acquainted with in the first part of the secretary's minutes. Gertrude Hunt, as I mentioned, Florence Hunt, and Ruth Snow was the librarian, as well as the treasurer of the board. That's where that $25 came from. She didn't pad her salary at all. And so on, down to 1950, after the war. This was a very big blank in the record at the town hall. From 1950 to 61, there's very minimal town reports where the library is concerned. They just had like an inch-long statement. This is what was spent on maintenance. This is what was spent on the librarian's salary, books, and so forth. There's no names, so that's another senior project for somebody to do at Parish Hill, to find out who was the librarians and what was going on in that whole decade of the 50s. But I'd like to fill you in from 1960, if you wouldn't mind, because as I read the record, it became a real renaissance, and that's my assessment. At the library, it marked a great demarcation from how it was used and how the books were circulated before that to from 1960 on. And I have to credit that to the librarian whose name was Sidney Chrysler, the only male who's ever held that position. And Sidney was the librarian. Some of you lived in town long enough ago that you remember Sidney. He lived on Chaplin Street in the first brick house as you come up the street. And he wrote the report. So obviously he could have put in what he wanted. But that was also a departure, because prior to that, the chairs of the board had always written the reports. He introduced such an expanded service of different services to the public that that's what I feel it was a renaissance. He expanded services that seemed to be more sensitive to the needs and preferences of patrons. For example, he always identified how many books were circulated and what age groups that took out books, juveniles or children. In fact, he emphasized children's books more than other librarians had, it seems to me. He started exhibits, which goes outside borrowing books. He invited residents to bring in their collections, for instance, pressed glass, to display at the library. Or at Christmas time, he had a collection of bells from citizens. He opened the library again after many years on Saturdays. Prior to that, it had been mostly open on Wednesdays. He started Story Hour in 1966. This was a bachelor. He didn't have children, but he started Story Hour. He also had a paperback exchange. Boy, I just think that's very forward-thinking in 1967. And he began to invite speakers in to talk about different topics. And it was during the time of his tenure, 1968, when the Ben Chaplin corner cupboard, the famous Ben Chaplin corner cupboard, came back to Chaplin and was then also filled with some donated china, beautiful lusterware china. So I'm now going to move on to the 70s, because he left in 1971. And a new chairperson came on, Pat Dubas. Yeah, I know Pat Dubas is here. Yeah, there he is. And because there were many different librarians that served during this period, I'm going to give you the credit for what happened in that library, you and your board, because that was another wonderful flowering time. It built upon what Sydney had done. Adele Swart is the director of the Story Hour. Do you remember that?
No.
You could borrow patterns, sewing patterns. That's not a book. I mean, this sewing pattern, so people could go home and make clothes for their family. You could borrow copies of paintings, hang in your house. So you could have a Rembrandt in your house for a while. Movies started to be shown, reel-to-reel movies. We had to borrow the machine from the elementary school, but we started showing movies at the library with popcorn too. So the kids could spill the popcorn. That was okay. Programs were introduced on Sunday afternoons. And here, some of you are going to, I hope, will smile because I found some of your names here. Guy Ricklin, you demonstrated your pewter making one of those times. Ruth Snow Bowen demonstrated her quilt making. And Therese Ridgway talked about weaving. Bob Dubas, you talked about maple syrup. Do you remember that? Well, the next one was me. I don't remember talking about the Native Americans of Connecticut, but apparently I did. Got into the minutes, into the report. So, I mean, here's the library extending more than just books and magazines. It's trying to broaden people's knowledge on local issues that they thought might be of interest. In 1977, an active Friends was formed. And we've just started a new Friends at the library now, but we had a very active one at the time. They held fundraising events like books and bake sales. I remember buying a whole set of Zane Greys that were being culled out of the library, and Guy got his P.G. Wodehouse, one of his favorite authors from the library. We had plant sales. We delivered books to the elderly and the disabled, and that again is something that the Friends are just going to start again. The library was open 4 days a week. That was really expanded from previous times. Mondays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Now it's Fridays and Saturdays, so it's open 4 days. Now we move on to the 1980s, and there was an emphasis. That was when I was on the board, and where's Ann Cecilian? Were you on the board then, Ann? 1980s? Who else? Kathy Smith was too. Anybody else? Okay. We emphasized maintenance that during my time, as I recall, because the roof was leaking really badly. It's a slate roof, and poor Mr. Helmer would climb up on the roof. I mean, he was just one of the people who did, with his pail of tar and slop tar on the roof to try to keep the rain out. But it just got to be too much during that time. And so we finally got it repaired by experienced slaters who had previously been working on the Mark Twain house roof in Hartford. So They knew what they were doing. That's some roof in Hartford. Bill Gould, who's an expert restorer, got up and fixed that balustrade around the tower. So that was quite a lot done. Oh, Scott Matthews, where's Scott? There. You remember installing a slot in the door so people could return their video cassettes? Well, he did. It's in the record. And Bob Garfallo, who lived in town at the time, built the book drop box there. First Selectman Joe Ferrara gave the library, not him personally, but the town, through Joe Ferrara, who was the first selectman, gave the town, the library $2,500 towards restoration work. So that was a quite nice gift. During that time, the board celebrated the 75th anniversary of the library, and we had a cake. Local children played instruments, and it was quite a nice event. I forgot to mention that during Sydney's time in the 60s, he had celebrated the 50th anniversary of the library, and so it's been recognized periodically. Ann Chu, who lives right next door to the library, not only was in charge of, well, I don't know if in charge, but she was part of the story hour, and she would also let people run to her house to use the facilities. And so it was a real collaboration for a while. Now the 1990s, that was a big era of transition, because in 1993, the Americans with Disability Act was passed. So the board under Johann Philbrick, you were there, and there was somebody else, Helen, you were on the board during the 90s. Anybody else on the board during the 90s? Here? Had to really grapple with this problem. I mean, look at the library. It's up a steep hill. Not only that, but so how are you going to do handicap access? It didn't have any facilities, any running water. The librarian, the hours of the library, particularly on Wednesday when it was open all day, except it was open like from 10 to 12, 2 to 4. So the poor lady could run home, and get a lunch, and there weren't any bathrooms. There wasn't a bathroom in the library. So there was some real difficulties with the physical structure. But besides that, over these years since the 60s, programs had built up. People were coming to movies. There were speakers in the library, and it just wasn't big enough. You couldn't properly have a group like this, for example. That would be impossible. So it was clear that the library had outlived its use. And in 1997, the board received $650,000 in a grant to renovate half of the elementary school, because by that time the new school on Palmer Road was in use. And in 1999, the transition was complete when the board announced in their report that the name would now be the Chaplin Public Library. So, end of that era. I just think that leaving the William Ross Library must have been bittersweet for everybody concerned because of its long years of exemplary service. And now the William Ross Library has entered a new phase of its own life and new possibilities as a privately owned building. And I'll just leave you with one last quote from the 1920 town report. Quote, "It is hoped that the townspeople will adequately appreciate the blessings they have in the fact of the library and will make the fullest use of it." And the fact that you're all here today is proof that the library is greatly appreciated and loved. So thank you so much for coming. Warren.
I want to tell you a story about how it almost didn't happen.
What almost didn't happen? The library?
The building.
Oh.
The William Ross Library.
Uh-huh.
William Ross, this junior, died in 1908. And he left a will which left everything to his wife, Emily. Yeah, Emily. And, but that was contested by William's uncle, who claimed that he was not of right mind when he signed the will. And if you look at the archives of the Norwich Bulletin, and I believe Hartford Current, they used to cover Chaplin pretty readily in those days. One of the big events in 1908 was not only the death of the richest man in Chaplin, who was William Ross Jr., but his probate. And the probate judge lived in Chaplin, in the village, and this created statewide attention, contesting of the will. And it took place, they had to delay the court action to get more witnesses. And the witnesses that were drawn in were local people who had to testify to his state of mind when he signed the will. And of course, we all know how the judge ruled that the will was valid. But to me, one of the interesting parts was that my grandfather, Clifton Church, was one of the persons that was brought in to testify that he was of sound mind.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question. How did they move the books?
Yes.
How did they move the books?
From the William Ross to this library?
Yeah.
I wasn't part of that scene, but I'm sure Johan could tell us.
Actually, I could not.
They
honestly don't
carried him
remember.
down the street. There was a long
I
line
can
of
remember
people.
them coming down the street, but just exactly and what we had then, I think, with the town trucks basically did most of it. But I could be wrong, that's just my memory.
Yes.
Is there any reading to find out more about the background of the Ross family?
Okay, well, I just wanted to address that quickly. I hadn't found anything other than history of Wyndham County. Very brief mention. I had to piece the genealogy together through sources and ancestry, and I'm happy to leave all of my materials with the town of Chaplin and Leslie. One thing I do want to address is William Ross Jr.'s will, which is part of this question. So thank you for bringing it up. I was sort of amazed to read it, and I was stunned to discover how wealthy a person he actually was. The will was contested for a long time, and a couple of years, during which time Emily requested that she be given a stipend on a, I think, monthly basis it may have been, so that she could continue to pursue the work on the library and that she had something to live on. But it's a very long probate record, and I was going to spare you of the details, but suffice it to say, he owned a lot of property in Willimantic, including downtown Willimantic and in East Lyme. So, and of course in Chaplin. So he was had quite a bit of real estate.
To not quickly just go over your question, Peggy, about how do they move the books. Bill, you were involved with a lot of that too, weren't you? The clearing out the library, or was that later?
Later.
Later. So it was
I think my
Helen.
bill might have been in office.
Helen?
I recall that the members of the board just came and packed up boxes, and our husbands, if they have a truck or whatever, some sort of vehicle, we just loaded stuff up and removed it.
I heard they lined up the kids.
trucks.
They passed book to book to book, ticket to kid.
The kids were there.
Yeah, just walked up and down the steps.
Yeah, I remember doing it.
So that was a huge community effort, obviously.
Yes, it
And
was.
yes,
We
Bob.
got the bookshelves that are in the present library. Bill Filbert was responsible for getting it. I think he got them from the Willamette Library, wasn't it? Because we went down there and dismantled it, and I remember moving them up here and installing them in this library.
Oh, you talking about the shelves, yeah.
The shelves,
That's right.
yeah.
We went down there and, we worked awfully hard on this new library, we really did.
Yes.
Ellen and I and the other members that were on that board. And, we did, absolutely. We went to Willimantic. We got many of the things that were in there brought us through, persuasion, I guess.
She was very good.
Yeah, I think we need to acknowledge that spouses were a huge part of this library and its business. I mean, with plant sales, there was, husbands hauling plants up and down the steps and helping, like Ray Hilmer, I mentioned, on the roof with his tar buckets and.
Well, that's why you mentioned early in the minutes that the women were in charge.
I noted that early on, I forgot to mention it, but early on, 3 out of the 6 people on the board of directors were women. And that's before the women gets the vote. I mean, and no other town office had women on it, I'm sure. The select board, the selectmen, I don't know about the school board, but I mean, I don't know, they didn't have a zoning board then. What is it, finance board? I mean, I'm sure the women weren't involved in those agencies, but where they've shown and really got their feet on the ground was at the library board. And also all the librarians were women until Sydney came along.
Did
Sandy?
you mention the flags?
What?
Did you
Oh, the
mention
flags, right.
Did you mention them?
No, I haven't
Okay.
yet. No, I
Okay.
forgot to mention it when I
Okay,
got to the history.
I just wanted us to make sure.
Mr. Vane got these framed for us, and they were found in the loft of the library. Could you tell us about them, maybe?
Sure, what little I know. It in fact was Pete Jakowski, who is working on the library now, doing some maintenance, who found them and identified them. They are 2 in a series of Liberty Loan flags from World War I. And the V, the Roman 5, indicates that the town of Chaplin completed the 5th series of the Liberty Loan program. And this flag indicates that they completed every single series. We have not finished cleaning out the attic of the library. I'm hopeful that maybe the first 4 flags in the series will turn up as we go through things up there. But I thought that was a terrific find and very clever of Pete to identify them for what they were.
And again, it's like, the library was the repository of things like this because there wasn't a museum. There wasn't another place that they could display them or save them for the future. So now we have these things. Okay, yes.
Do you have any information on the education of Mrs. Ross? Because if she was left all that wealth and money and not anything specific in the will to start the library, it must have been near and dear to her heart, which indicates she was an educated woman.
This is a real love story. You want to tell it about how she met William Ross and at what point in his life and everything?
Well, he was 70, when I was checking out his genealogy, I noticed that he was a single man until the age of 71, when a lady came to take care of him. And in this very big house. And because he was infirm at the time, and apparently he fell in love with her and asked her to marry him, which he did. And the last 4 years of their lives together were spent developing the plans for this library. And
very, very, telling.
Yeah, Emily Ross was married before she married
She was.
William.
She had 2 sons.
And she had a son, William Clark, who was the first governor of it wasn't a state then, but the territory of Alaska. And he used to visit Chaplin, and that was a big deal in the newspapers. Because on his way to talk to President Taft, he
Stopped in
he stopped in Chaplin and sometimes would give a talk at the church. So that was big news. And then after William died, and she had a chauffeur that she fell in love with, and they married. So she was married after William Ross. So she made the social columns.
And the chauffeur was very young
Very young.
compared to her.
And it was, what was his name?
Was it Ralph something?
The Vale. We used to call it the Vale House. The chauffeur's name was the Vale.
Ralph
The
Vale.
Vale. And when my mother came to town, she came to nurse a person in that house. Mrs. Vale's, I don't know, cousin or something was living there. Her aunt, yeah. And so there's a lot of stories. And then this past year, the Ross descendants who were living in West Virginia and in Paris, France, one of the descendants bought out her siblings. She was a fashion designer and an actress in Paris. So she was able to buy out her siblings and so to consolidate all the property. And she gave 253 acres on Tower Hill Road this past year to Joshua's Trust to keep in perpetuity. So,
I should probably talk with Warren rather than just bringing it up, but you were talking, Leslie, about a school project.
Yeah.
And for years, we've talked in the town about the murder at the house.
Yes.
And Warren would probably know more than
the
anyone.
murder didn't happen
All
in the
that I
house.
know is that it involved Deming and it might have involved Tom. But it's such a mystery that surrounded this. that
When was this
someone
murder?
should almost write a book about it. I mean, since I came to Chaplin, I've heard it's older people talk about it, many people that are gone now. And it's just, as I say, you were talking about a school project.
Yeah.
It might be very interesting for someone to try to research that, because that was presumably coming down in gossip, a love story as well.
When was it, Warren? When was this murder?
I think there's been a few murders in Chaplin. We think we're such a quiet town. But in the Ross family, the murder did not take place in Chaplin. It happened after the family had moved to West Virginia. And it was the one of, I believe, Emily's daughter at that time was murdered, bludgeoned to death, and they never solved that. And her kids moved to Paris and so forth. But we have not, I do a lot of work for the trust, and I've been trying to research some of the history too of the Ross family. And we try not to dwell on the murder, because we're just happy that they, gave us the land and wanted to dig up some bad memories.
Any other questions?
I have one.
Yes.
I was
wondering if there are many books left from the early days of the library that are still in our current collection.
There are, there are some display cases over in the library where I try and rotate in some of the books that were from the first collections, because we have the catalogs from some of the early years. And so I know this is a book from this date, from this catalog. So there's not, I wouldn't say there's a ton, but there definitely are some, partly because along the way, things haven't been needed very frequently in the library. So,
Turns out to be good.
which is a good thing now, because we pulled some off and found some gems that were in there, because we have started doing some things. Yeah. And I should take a minute to also say, Leslie mentioned the Friends group is restarting, and the Friends are helping with these events, bringing in the food and setting up the coffee. And if anybody's interested in learning more about it, Adele Swart is kind of the person helping to get this going, along with a group of other people. So if you have questions, and so thank you very much for providing this, and thank you so much for the talk.
Well, hope some of you, when you get something to refresh you, come on up and take a look at the genealogy and the list of all the librarians. And I found a clipping of me giving a story hour back in the day. So you can take a look at that more closely. My daughter Abigail is this little baby girl right here. So she is. She's very cute. So anyway, come on up and have a look at things, and we'd love to chat with you. Yes.
When did the library close? What year?
The changeover came in 1999, correct? Yeah. So it's been closed since then, almost, for quite some time. So I'm so glad it's now owned, so it can get the care and love that it needs.
Thank you, Mel.
All right. Thank you.